Right, still good morning, I think, 11:45. Morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Alvin, for inviting me to this conference. I've learnt a lot from a lot of people. So I'm going to talk about the IHRA definition and its critics, and I've left a handout for everybody. I'll be referring to this as I do the talk. In 2016, the British government ratified a version of the EUMC definition of anti-Semitism, adopted earlier that year by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, known as the IHRA definition. In 2017 and 2018, the Labour Party, under its new hard-left leader, Jeremy Corbyn, then, as now, widely accused of anti-Semitism, was placed under considerable pressure to adopt a definition. This the National Executive Committee finally did in September 2018, but only subject to a caveat to the effect that its adoption would in no way constrain criticism of Israel. The IHRA definition thus became central to a political dispute that threatened to split and gravely weaken one of the main British political parties. It is therefore hardly surprising that 2017 and 2018 also saw the publication in Britain of a series of critical articles attacking the definition as obscure, unfair, and harmful in the practical effects to be feared from its wide adoption. These included two extended, carefully argued opinions sought by Palestinian-supporting non-governmental organisations from two senior British lawyers specialising in human rights, Hugh Tomlinson QC and Geoffrey Robertson QC. The conclusions of both are supported in an article by a third distinguished legal authority, Sir Stephen Sedley, and finally by a full-dress scholarly study by a professor of Islamic and comparative literature at the University of Birmingham, Rebecca Ruiz-Gould. In general, these criticisms focus on two alleged defects in the IHRA definition. On the one hand, that it allegedly fails to show that several of the examples it offers are actually examples of anti-Semitism, and on the other that, in consequence of that alleged failure, any attempt to apply the definition as a means of restraining supposedly anti-Semitic speech or action must pose grave dangers to freedom of speech. The object of the present paper, whose authors are respectively a non-Jewish philosopher, that's my co-author, Professor Bernard Harrison, who unfortunately couldn't be at the conference, and a Jewish academic lawyer, that's yours truly, is to examine the validity of these two claims. The IHRA definition opens with a general characterization of anti-Semitism, and that is one on the handout. Both Tomlinson and Robertson argue that this initial characterization amounts to the identification of anti-Semitism as a form of hatred, and that this severely limits the utility of the IHRA definition as a means of identifying cases of anti-Semitism in legally contested contexts. No act or utterance can be classed as anti-Semitic by the terms of the definition unless it can be shown that it expresses, quote, hatred, unquote, towards, as Robertson puts it, quote, Jewish people as a race, unquote. This difficulty, both lawyers argue, throws into question the identification as instances of anti-Semitism of a range of examples so identified in a later section of the definition, which is 2 on the handout. All four of our critics then argue that the IHRA definition, illicitly, allegedly by its own standards, identifying such acts or utterances as anti-Semitic, when they in fact express not prejudice against Jews in general, but political opposition to Zionism and the government of Israel, constitutes a threat to freedom of speech. Sir Stephen Sedley, our third legal critic, in a 2017 article in the London Review of Books, captures the general mood on this point, and that can be found at point 3 on the handout. In fact, all three legal authorities cited above impose an interpretation on the opening paragraph of the IHRA definition, specifically upon the sentence reading, quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred of Jews." That sentence is ambiguous as it stands. On the one hand, it identifies anti-Semitism as a perception. In ordinary English, a perception is a belief state. In other words, to perceive something X in a certain manner is to entertain a specific collection of beliefs concerning X. In the same breath, the sentence identifies anti-Semitism as an emotional disposition, hatred of Jews. Such a disposition may contain an element of belief, but equally it may not. Thus, Peter may hate spinach because, absurdly, he believes it to lower sexual energy. Or he may just hate it, period. Belief states and emotional dispositions, in other words, are different kinds of thing. So which kind of thing is anti-Semitism? The only sensible answer is both. Anti-Semitism can manifest itself in either of these conceptually quite distinct forms, as an emotional state with Jews as its object, or as a collection or system of beliefs about Jews. The first of these guises, social anti-Semitism, is a version of what sociologists and social psychologists like to call ethnic prejudice. The second, political anti-Semitism, is a delusive explanatory theory concerning the supposedly central role played, not by this or that individual Jew, but by a supposedly all-powerful and malign Jewish collectivity in controlling non-Jewish life and history. The theory in question purports to explain why some current turn of events is, as perceived by the anti-Semite and his friends, going badly for non-Jews. The purported explanation is that the non-Jewish institutions that appear to be in charge of events have ceased to discharge their proper function. They have ceased to do so because they have been hollowed out and taken over by agents of a vast Jewish conspiracy and perverted to the service of Jewish ends. In the face of the Jewish threat, there is little that can be done by the simple and deluded non-Jew, unless and until he or she has been sufficiently aroused to the urgency of that threat to take action against it, action that can only consist in expelling the Jews wholesale from their secret positions of power, at which point the world will, if the job has been done properly, inevitably return to the state of normality from which the Jewish conspiracy alone has perverted it. While the specific accusations levelled against Jews by this or that version of political anti-Semitism may change, the main tenets of the theory remain, in all its versions, roughly as stated in 4 on the handout. Two leading and connected features of the theory are its exceptionalism and its eliminationism with respect to Jews. On the one hand, it holds that the Jewish community is exceptional in the sense of being radically unlike any other human group. On the other, it sees this supposed exceptionalism as posing insuperable difficulties to assimilation. The Jewish community, in short, is so radically other that it cannot be lived with, it can only be gotten rid of, that is, eliminated in one way or another. Finally, it goes without saying that the entire theory is delusive. The problem is not just that the Jewish community is too small, too divided, and too much at odds with itself to be capable of secretly taking over the world, although it manifestly is all of those things. It is rather that no community could possibly play the role envisaged for Jews by the political anti-Semite, Political anti-Semitism, in short, requires no refutation. It refutes itself by its own internal absurdities. At the present time, there exists a strong temptation felt by many on the left to articulate opposition to Israel in terms of a refurbished version of political anti-Semitism. The temptation arises in the following way. An enduring vein of opposition to Israel, one expressed by Iran, Hamas and Hezbollah, among others, and with which a substantial section of the Western left sympathises, is essentially revanchist in character. It wishes to see the result of the 1947-48 war reversed. It wishes to see Israel abolished as a Jewish majority state and replaced by a Muslim Arab majority state, from which Jews would either be expelled or remain as a minority. It is essential to the business of promoting this programme, particularly in the West, to have some good reason for claiming that the State of Israel is illegitimate, that it should never have been allowed to come into existence in the first place, and should not be allowed to continue in existence now. One obvious way of pursuing this goal is to claim that a state can reasonably be regarded as illegitimate and ripe for abolition when it embraces, as a condition of its very existence, policies so harmful to human rights that its existence can no longer be tolerated. And this is the line of argument behind which the BDS supporting left has, broadly speaking, chosen to place itself. A state makes itself illegitimate by committing evil, by the gravity of its crimes. And if the only Jewish state in the world is also the only state in the world whose legitimacy as a state anyone is prepared to question, this is because, so the argument goes, the crimes of the Jewish state far exceed in gravity those of any other state in the world. Such claims are, of course, not easy to drive home in detail. Events from 1914 to the present day have set the bar of atrocity far too high for it to be easily surmounted by a nation as small and civilized as Israel. Where are the Israeli atrocities capable of standing comparison with those committed by, to name a few, the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, the Assad regime in Syria, ISIL in Iraq and Syria, or the Nazis, first in Germany, and later throughout Europe between 1933 and 1945. To create a body of opinion prepared to see Israel as a pariah state, however, it is hardly necessary to make out a detailed case against Israel. All that is necessary is to find some means of associating Israel in suitably receptive minds with things already widely considered to represent the nadir of evil. Such things include Nazism, racism, the apartheid regime in South Africa, colonialism and war, among others. And such associations, as Dr. Goebbels taught us long ago, can be implanted in receptive minds at the cost of very little in the way of argument or appeal to verifiable fact. All that it is necessary to do is to repeat them as frequently as possible in the context of any current news item that can be spun in such a way as to give them some degree of anecdotal foothold. In this way, it has become, over the past 20 years or so, axiomatic in certain sectors of Western opinion that Israel is a Nazi state, that it is a racist or apartheid state, that it is a colonial settler state, that it is the main threat to peace in the Middle East and perhaps in the world itself, and so on. As those of us at this conference know, these more specific claims turn out on closer examination to be no more consonant with the facts than the more general claim that Israel's crimes exceed in gravity those of all other nations, which they purport to explain in detail. In short, what we are dealing with in the anti-Zionist propaganda put about by BDS and the elements of the Western left that support it is not criticism of Israel, but rather politically motivated defamation. Moreover, it follows a pattern made familiar by earlier versions of political anti-Semitism, including the pre-war Nazi version. That is to say, it offers an explanation of certain disturbing features of modern life. In the present case, the ever-renewed turmoil in the Near East and the Maghreb, along with the ongoing problems for European societies caused by that turmoil, in terms of the putative centrality to these disquieting events of the Jew, as represented for present purposes by the State of Israel. The explanation offered is that the upheavals in the region over the past half-century, along with the putatively otherwise inexplicable hostility of many in the Islamic world towards Europe, are entirely to be explained by the natural resentment felt by the indigenous inhabitants of the region for the implantation among them by the European powers in, it is said, a misguided attempt to compensate the Jews for the Holocaust of a Jewish polity, Israel, whose crimes exceed those of all other nations in modern history, including those of the Third Reich. Given the extraordinary gravity of these crimes, the argument continues, the only way of addressing the situation is to work by every means possible towards the overthrow of the Jewish political autonomy in Israel. Once that goal is achieved, the argument concludes, displaying at this point a degree of blindness to the actual savagery of Middle Eastern politics that will surprise only those unfamiliar with the intellectual left. Palestine will become, as it should always have been, a Muslim majority state in which Jews may continue to live perfectly happily as a minority, while the region, relieved at last of the poisonous and disruptive presence of organised Jewry, will also return to a state of peace and prosperity in which its affairs will cease to trouble the nations of Europe. Such a view shares the exceptionalism and eliminationism characteristic of political anti-Semitism in all its forms. They are indeed built in the fundamental claim of BDS that the crimes of Israel are far in excess of those of any other nation, exceptionalism, and that the Jewish state, again, unlike any other, therefore lacks legitimacy, eliminationism. The problem with this version of political anti-Semitism, as with earlier versions, is that its main doctrines compose a tissue of delusions so bizarre that no subordinate argument could possibly succeed in establishing them in reality. Once one sees that anti-Semitism can take the form either of an emotional disposition or of a body of delusive pseudo-explanatory theory, the line of criticism articulated by Tomlinson, Robertson, Sedley et al. Falls to the ground. The Ihra Definition shortlist of examples referring to Israel are indeed examples of anti-Semitic acts or utterances. They comprise, in effect, denying the right of the Jewish people to exercise political autonomy, describing Israel as an essentially racist or Nazi state, exerting the existence of a Jewish conspiracy in relation to Israel, asserting concern for the welfare of Israel among non-Israeli Jews to argue lack of concern for the welfare of their nations of citizenship, and singling out Israel for condemnation in respect of conduct passed over or condoned in other nations. As we have already noted, none of these claims can be defended by the sober recitation of fact. They primarily involve, therefore, defamation of Israel of a type characteristic of political anti-Semitism. But given that a majority of Jews support Israel, these claims also involve defamation of Jews individually by falsely representing them as supporters of an essentially Nazi and racist neo-colonial state. They are therefore anti-Semitic even by Sedley's criterion of expressing, quote, hostility towards Jews as Jews, unquote. The commitment of anti-Zionism and BDS to anti-Semitism in this latter sense is further evident by the fact that anti-Zionist political activity, both on and off campus, is virtually exclusively directed at Israel supporting Jews and Jewish organizations, ignoring the extensive non-Jewish support enjoyed by Israel in Western countries. Given that the kinds of hostility towards Israel identified as anti-Semitic by the Ihra definition are without exception defamatory in character, It further follows, contrary to the expressed opinion of our legal and academic critics, that the definition can pose no threat to freedom of speech. Under the European Convention of Human Rights, which by virtue of the Human Rights Act 1998 is incorporated into UK domestic law, freedom of speech is a qualified right. Article 10 of the European Convention clearly combines the principle of freedom of speech with the need to protect the rights of others, including status and safety. While the law of defamation protects status, hate crime legislation protects safety. Section 18 of the Public Order Act 1986 criminalises words, behaviour or material which is intended to stir up racial hatred or which is likely, having regard to all the circumstances, to stir up racial hatred, defined as, quote, hatred against a group of persons defined by reference to colour, race, nationality, including citizenship, or ethnic or national origin, unquote. The expression must be, quote, threatening, abusive, or insulting, unquote, to constitute hate speech, and there is no free speech defence to racial hatred. Judging by the annual anti-Semitic incident reports produced by the Community Security Trust, it appears that the examples that our critics reject as anti-Semitic incite attacks against Jews. Attacks spiked during clashes between Israel and Hamas, presumably because of the increase in the demonising rhetoric identified as anti-Semitic in the IHRA definition. This is why the police force's hate crime operational guidance and the Crown Prosecution Service has incorporated the IHRA definition with all 11 examples. To conclude, the short list of specific lines of attack on Israel in the IHRA definition are anti-Semitic not in terms of intent, as Robertson and Tomlinson contend proof is needed. They said for those to be anti-Semitic, you need to prove intent to be anti-Semitic. So they're not anti-Semitic in terms of intent, but in terms of content and likely consequence. Park AR4 critics, there is not in the end a great deal wrong with the IHRA definition as a guide to current anti-Semitism. If it has a defect, it is merely that the ambiguity in its opening general characterization of the nature of anti-Semitism needlessly allows critics to read it as stressing the identity of anti-Semitism as an emotional disposition, while ignoring its other identity as a form of pseudo-explanatory delusion. But that is a defect that can be easily remedied.
Standing between you and lunch.